Hello, and thank you very much for coming along again this evening. This evening we're treated to an extraordinary array of events that have occurred this last week, both nationally and internationally. And I want to cover some of them because they're part of our whole reconsideration of our circumstance in the global climate, in global environmental change, and the prospects for human survival. We've never had a more dramatic week in some respects, including impeachment operations going on one side of the Atlantic, and a head of government, I should say a head of Parliament, the Prime Minister in England, being told by his Supreme Court in an 11-0 vote that he had acted illegally in suspending Parliament when he did. And questions of democracy on both sides of the Atlantic occurring very quickly and disrupting the real focus of the global summit on climate change in New York City, called by the Secretary General in reference to the fact that none of the nation states have lived up to their promises in the 2015 accord, which they signed in Paris, the great international climate accord. Now, there's one person who's drawn this to the attention of the world quite dramatically, in a riveting way, for the last year. In fact, it's just about a year ago that she started to strike, a school strike in Sweden. Her name is Greta Thunberg. And this took on with such importance and such immediate attraction throughout the world that it's become a global phenomenon. Greta Thunberg's grand achievement is something we want to look at this point. And the enduring challenge that she's left world leaders with, and in fact all leaders since then. Because the question she poses is, can we survive the institutions that we've created? It's not self-evident that we can. Basically, Greta Thunberg ignited climate strikes all over the world. She stopped going to school on Fridays. And she said she wasn't going to go to school again on Fridays ever, unless the Swedish Parliament did something meaningful on climate change. Well, that idea took off around all of Europe in an amazing way. And in fact, across the globe, down in Australia and New Zealand, all across the world, 2,000 cities have taken place in strikes in the name of this group that Greta set up called Fridays for the Future. Not going to school on Fridays because we're going to devote Fridays for the future. Why go to school when there's no future for us, say these youth. And it's actually taken hold in places like India. Not yet in China, but in India. And India is pretty extraordinary. If you get the Extinction Rebellion joining up with the Fridays for the Future and spreading their message throughout the largest democracy, English-speaking democracy in the world, is pretty extraordinary. The Indians joined the global climate strike for all of this past week, and it's pretty extraordinary when you see how it's been pulled off. She speaks in English, actually pretty good English, better English than most 16-year-olds in the United States speak. And no matter where she speaks, she welcomes their activity on climate change. Take a look at this speech in Rome. It's absolutely riveting, and one that's unforgettable.
Ciao Roma! You should be very proud of yourselves. Our future was sold so that a small number of people could make unimaginable amounts of money. It was stolen from us every time the adults said that the sky was the limit and that you only live once. They lied to us. They gave us false hope. They told us that the future was something to look forward to. And yes, some of us can have whatever we want for now. Many of us can buy much more than we will ever need. But the only thing we really need is a future. Humanity is standing at a crossroads. We are here today because we have decided which path we want to take. And now we are waiting for the others to follow our example. In the last 6 months, millions of school children, not least in Italy, have been school striking for the climate. To be honest, there is no political change whatsoever in sight. That is why we have to prepare ourselves for that this will take a long time. We have to continue for a long time. This will not take weeks. This will not take months. This will take years.
Now, this will take years has been her message around the world, and she's traveled around the world. In her demonstration, she's not only attracted youth, but an extraordinary outpouring of elderly people as well. In fact, it's a cross-generational appeal. And as you can tell here in the Canadian broadcast of the material, it's brought out as many elders as it has youth. It's brought her into contact with world leaders all over the globe, including former President Barack Obama, who felt it was necessary to greet her and meet her when she came to Washington, D.C. and talked to the American House of Representatives. Amnesty International gave her an extraordinary award as Ambassador of Conscience. It's a very rare award that they give out, and Kumi Naidoo, the South African leader of Amnesty International, has given her extraordinary praise in Washington, D.C. as she addressed the congressman. Before coming over to the States, she met with Pope Francis and in fact made the school strike a center point of it. Join the climate strike, as she invited him to do. And a new kind of leadership on climate and environmental issues is emerging around the world, being cemented by the largest voices for traditional religion plus the youngest voices in the world. She came over to the States in a zero-emissions boat, traveling at about 30 knots per hour at some points, in a speed racing boat that had on its sails, "We race to win," and "Unite behind the science." This is the key message she brings. Unite behind the science. She got here and started coordinating things this last week, and they were coordinated around her where she would in effect show up to give speeches to various rallies, a whole week long of rallies during the time when the summit was to be taking place in New York, where she in fact did address people and heads of state. The message wasn't very sweet or pretty. Take a look.
This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering. People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?
How dare you? Fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? All you can talk about is the money, the profit, and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. This is how she sees it being related to the climate issue. She's not asking people to change light bulbs or to recycle this or that. She's looking at the fundamentals that are driving the growth economics. Now, Greta's not been the first person to point out the dangers of the corporate fantasies of continuous economic growth in the face of climate change. More than a decade ago, Noam Chomsky pointed out that corporations banded together to destroy public awareness of global climate change, and they were successful. Take a look at the way he put it.
The Chamber of Commerce, the main business lobby, the American petroleum industry, other business lobbies have publicly proclaimed, in fact with enthusiasm, that they are carrying out a campaign to try to convince the population that global warming is a liberal hoax. And it's succeeded, unfortunately. The latest polls I've seen show maybe a third of the population believes in anthropogenic global warming. The media contribute in their own way. So, for example, when the New York Times runs a front-page article on what meteorologists think about global warming, namely, they don't believe it. Meteorologists are pretty faces who read scripts telling you if it's going to rain tomorrow. What do they have to say any more than your barber? But that's presented as if it's a significant contribution to the discussion.
Right, and he goes on to point out this is part of the obfuscation that's pretty systemic in America. Corporate power doesn't want you to know what's going on. And they're tied to that ignorance strategy because that's the way they make profit. Take a look.
But what's rather interesting about this, and tells you something about the nature of our society, is that those same CEOs and managers who are trying to convince the public that it's a liberal hoax know perfectly well that it's extremely dangerous. They have the same beliefs that you and I have. So they're caught in a kind of an institutional contradiction. As leaders of major corporations, they have an institutional role. That is to maximize short-term profit. And if they don't do that, they're out and someone else is in who does do it.
Well, that's the key right there, right? It's an institutional contradiction. And if they want to keep their job, they have to maximize short-term profit. Forget the implications for the whole ecosystem and the survival of the human race. That doesn't matter. They're out if they don't maximize short-term profit.
So it's basically, institutionally speaking, it's not a choice. That's going to happen in the major institutions. So they may know that they're mortgaging the future of their grandchildren, and in fact, maybe everything they own will be destroyed, but they're caught in a trap of institutional structure. That's what happens in market systems. Financial crisis is a small example of the same thing. You may know that what you're doing carries systemic risk, but you can't calculate that into your transactions, or you're not fulfilling your role and somebody else replaces you. In fact, in the United States, it's actually a legal obligation to do that for corporate executives. So, and that's a very serious problem. It means that we're marching over the cliff and doing it for institutional reasons that are pretty hard to dismantle. Now, if this was happening in some small country, and maybe I don't know what, Monaco or something, it wouldn't matter much. But when it's happening in the richest, most powerful country in the world, it's a danger to the survival of the species. Nobody else is going to do very much if the United States doesn't do a lot, not just some, but take the lead. So we're essentially saying, let's kiss each other goodbye.
Right. Under corporate dominance, we're essentially saying, let's kiss each other goodbye. Why? Because institutionally they're committed to short-term profit, and it's that short-term profit that makes money off extracting and refining and selling and burning fossil fuels. Corporations are wedded to the notion of continuous growth, growth without limit, even though this can't happen. Can't happen, won't happen in a finite ecosystem. This was pointed out years ago in 1972 by a book written for the Club of Rome for the first meeting of gathering of international members of the environment community in Stockholm, Sweden. It was a book called Limits to Growth. The right wing has dismissed this book ever since, but it is not only true, it's ever more true. And the history of that has now been written in great detail. You can get a copy of it, called Losing Earth, A Recent History by Nathaniel Rich. Over the last 4 decades, a handful of scientists, politicians, and strategists led by 2 unlikely heroes risked their careers in a desperate, escalating campaign to convince the world to act before it was too late. Losing Earth is their story. You should see it. You should get hold of this book and read it cover to cover. Jim Hansen began the testimony about the danger of a heating climate. Others came in showing that this could lead to an overshoot and collapse situation. And like Greta Thunberg, decades before Greta Thunberg, David Attenborough reminded us that the idea of eternal economic growth is a mad fantasy. He pointed out this in a great lecture in London.
Many people would like to deny that this is so. They would like to believe in that oxymoron, sustainable growth. Kenneth Boulding, President Kennedy's environmental advisor 45 years ago, said something about this. Anyone who believes in indefinite growth in anything physical on a physically finite planet, he said, is either mad or an economist.
That's it. Either mad or an economist. Or, in fact, both. Mad economists have been running the ecosystem and the governments being advised by them ever since. Most recently, Sir David has emphasized that the greatest threat to humanity is one we face now with climate change. The greatest threat in thousands of years, he pointed out. Well, this is what Greta Thunberg is pointing out, and what she's so disturbing the radical right and corporate world about is that she is striking to disrupt the system. It's not Madam Sweetness and Light here. This is a statement about what's viable for human survival. She's joined up with Extinction Rebellion, asking to use natural climate solutions, not gimmicks, not gadgets, not things that can be bought with capital, not new fangled systems sold to you by petroleum countries, or the fictions of clean coal sold to the president and everyone else in his camp. No. She's threatening that by saying, listen, we need to adopt natural systems to reinsert ourselves into biogeochemical processes. And she's enlisting new groups and, in fact, teaming up with old groups like Native Americans, both in Canada and the United States and around the world, as well as the latest financial analysis, saying to the people who are running the divestment campaigns, keep going with these divestment campaigns. In fact, block the banks that are, in fact, trying to sell you solutions, and it's taking hold. Take a listen. This is pretty extraordinary in a way.
European climate protests spread to Bern, Switzerland this weekend, where thousands gathered in the capital city to call for more action to curb climate change. The climate activists, young and old, carried signs, some that read, "Stop denying Earth is dying," and "There is no planet B." The National Climate Strike was part of a week-long series of demonstrations around the world, rallying around UN Climate Week and the message Swedish activist Greta Thunberg started. In Bern today, protesters demanded that Swiss banks stop financing companies that extract oil, gas, and coal. The demonstration also called for an end to the use of fossil fuels in Switzerland. I'm Louise Schiavone, NPR News, Washington.
Well, NPR News in Washington is catching up with the fact that the banks are being focused upon around the world now as really quite problematic because they're providing the financing for this in a world that can no longer afford fossil fuels. So the banks are the target. Greta Thunberg's grand achievement has been that she's challenged this whole kind of growthism that is challenged, in fact, forwarded by Cecil Rhodes and other sort of imperial figures in the 19th century who became the poster child of the domination and unlimited growth model and just said, no, they can't do it. We can't survive the institutions you've set up, the banks, the corporations, and the unlimited growth fictions that come with them. So she said, no, not going to happen. And she said it now to 4 million people on one weekend.
Hello, New York City. It is an honor for me to be here with all of you today on this historical day. And thank you all so much for coming. I heard they were in New York, they're still counting, but at least 250,000 people. Around the world today, about 4 million people have been striking. We are still counting. So, this is the biggest climate strike ever in history. And we all should be so proud of ourselves because we have done this together.
We have done this together. She's gone around the world and mobilized the world to look at this whole question. Now, this was on the 20th, right? And as she says at the end of the speech, this is only the beginning. She's countering past myths with current realities and saying, listen, pay attention to the science. Not these myths of infinite growth. Not going to happen on a finite planet. Sober up and get to the point of getting off carbon. If human civilization is going to survive, our leaders must learn about the limits in a finite ecosystem. Fortunately, there is a new kind of citizen science alliance that is emerging around the world to work together to devise a just transition to a sustainable future.